All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4, which will be covering chapter 3 of our text. I hope everyone's having a great time so far in the class. I know the material is kind of rough at some points, and it will only get rougher just because that's the subject matter that we're dealing with. I will remind you that I hope that you take care of yourself as you are going through this class. If something is triggering, or anything like that, please reach out to the counseling center. We do have that available to you as students at Georgia Southern. So let's dive in. I will tell you that I am not going to spend a whole lot of time on the research portion of this chapter. We will spend the majority of our time on the theoretical underpinnings and the theories of family violence. That's where the majority of our time will be spent. So I will encourage you to take notes as we go through this. I don't put everything on the slide. You do have access to the publisher's PowerPoint, but as you can see, I create my own PowerPoints out of the material. I may add to some of it and things like that. So you do need to take notes as we go through this and pay attention. This will be time stamped as always, as with all of the videos. So yeah, let's dive in. As you have read chapter 3, you will see that this chapter really deals with how we conduct research, the importance of research, um, typical research that has been done in the family violence realm. And then it also, the end of the chapter goes through the theoretical underpinnings of family violence. So let's start out with research. As you can see with every presentation, we do have learning objectives. These are your learning objectives for the week in and of itself. So after the end of this presentation, you should be able to discuss the value of research, describe the historical significance of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, identify at least 4 major sources of data on domestic violence, and differentiate between the theory on domestic violence and intimate partner relationships as either family violence or violence against women. And then you should be able to state the 8 steps in achieving coercive control. I will also add, you at the end of this presentation, you would be remiss if you did not look at some of the additional material that is up in Folio. I think it's a 5-minute video called Eggshells that kind of takes you through a domestic violence incident from the viewpoint of the victim. And I would encourage you to try to apply the coercive control methods to what you are watching. If you are able to do that, then you should be good for the exam. There will be an essay portion of exam 1 where you will need to apply and explain a situation and the coercive control methods used in that situation. So I would implore that you at least, even though it's an optional video, to get some practice in doing that, watch that video and try to kind of talk yourself through and write out what you see. All right, so we're going to start out our conversation with trying to explain, why should we care about research? Why is research important? Well, research is important because it offers a way to reconcile our reality with the experiential reality. So it helps us better understand what's going on with certain phenomena. In this class, we're looking at the phenomena of family violence. Through scientific inquiry, we can observe and record information. Documenting research provides opportunities to replicate studies to help avoid overgeneralization, selective observation, and illogical reasoning. Replication lessens the possibility that political or personal biases drive the research results. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about some of the common research methods and specific sources of information that guide our understanding of family violence in the criminal justice world. I will also add to that we do research so that we can understand our reality in the form of domestic violence. Why your last discussion post was, why is there so much violence against women in the world? Well, in order to understand that, we have to research that and try to find common themes. And so really research is about finding those themes and trying to explain those themes or those characteristics. Now, this is not a research class. Hopefully you have had a research class. If you have not, then you will get a lot more information about methodology and kind of how to set up hypotheses and things like that in that class. We are just going to do an overgeneralization of research methods here. All right, so there are two main types of research. The first type is what's known as pure research. And pure research is conducted for the sake of knowledge. Pure research is your theoretical principles and how those developed over time. Then we have applied research. And applied research is the most utilized type of research in the criminal justice world. And this type of research centers on a problem being identified that's affecting a population and us wanting to understand the causes or the effects of that problem. And so you see a lot of applied research being utilized for policy matters and kind of being able to address issues through finding a better understanding of those issues. That brings me to the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. And the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment is a fascinating and important experiment in terms of family violence. And why is that? Well, the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment was the first controlled, randomized test of effectiveness of the arrest of the perpetrator. So the entire purpose of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment was to test whether offenders being arrested in Minneapolis was affecting outcomes of domestic violence. So their findings suggest that arresting the perpetrator produced the least amount of repeat violence for the same victim within a 6-month time frame. And if that victim had subsequent incidents, those were reduced by nearly 50% when the suspect was arrested. Now, pay attention to this. This was in the 1980s. And so that was when we were starting to understand and kind of have this phenomenon coming back into our forefront of thought and reason. And so the Minneapolis experiment basically tested that area in Minneapolis. All right, so that's important to note that they weren't testing a nationwide sample. They were testing a smaller sample in their city. But there were some generalizations that could be made out of the findings, right? So the purpose of a research is to be able to and applied research at that, is to be able to generalize the findings to a larger population. Well, some of the recommendations that came out of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment was that the obvious one. Well, if we're finding that arresting the offender decreases the likelihood of reoffending in 6 months, and it also decreases repeated victimization by nearly 50%, then a policy implication out of this should be that police arrest the offenders in these circumstances, right? But another recommendation came out of this, and that other recommendation was that we need to test this theory on a broader scale. So we need to take it from the small sample of Minneapolis and we need to replicate it across the nation to see if this generalization is a reality. And so the recommendation was that the experiment should be replicated in other jurisdictions. And finally, counterintuitive to what one might think, the recommendation was made to not make mandatory laws, mandatory arrest laws out of this one experiment. So why would they say that? If our first generalization was that this looks like it's effective, arresting the perpetrator is effective, and we're making some policy implications out of that, why wouldn't we make mandatory sentencing or mandatory arrest laws across the nation? Well, there's two reasons. So one, this experiment, again, the sample size was small. So we're generalizing based off of a small sample size without the replication. And so that's why the recommendation of replicating this experiment was made, is that we need to make sure that we're not overgeneralizing the findings of this study. And the second reason is that if states implemented mandatory arrest laws, then that would reduce the chances for further replication to happen. Because if we are taking the stance that we're going to do mandatory arrest laws and we're arresting alleged perpetrators in these instances automatically, then we're not going to be able to further study whether that's an effective measure because it's already been implemented, right? So that's why they made that recommendation. Well, several years later, the several different academics took up that recommendation of replication, and we see what is called the spouse assault replication program. And the entire purpose of this program was to replicate the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment in several different jurisdictions throughout the nation. We wanted to see if the generalizations that was made in the Minneapolis experiment could be replicated throughout the nation. So what were their findings? Well, the findings were mixed. They found that arrest only deterred certain types of perpetrators. And they found that the findings in the Minneapolis experiment were not replicated. Therefore, the Minneapolis experiment overgeneralized the findings to a broader public whenever it was errored in its sample size. And so one of the issues with this is that even though the Minneapolis experiment said, whoa, hang on, we need replication, we don't want you to enforce mandatory arrest laws, the nation didn't really listen to them. And they went ahead and implemented mandatory arrest laws. So by the time that the spouse assault replication program came into effect, and by the time their findings were published, you already had these mandatory laws on the books in the nation. And so you have contradictory findings with the spouse assault program and the Minneapolis experiment in terms of the effectiveness of the arrest. And so that really kind of caused an issue that we're still kind of running into today, because a lot of states have mandatory arrest laws. And we find that you really kind of have mixed results with those laws. They don't work for everyone. They're not cookie cutter, and spousal abuse and domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that is not a one-size-fits-all resolution. So it's important to kind of see that is how the Minneapolis experiment is how we utilize applied research. And hang on one second, I'm trying to do your timestamps for you. Okay, so let's go back and kind of talk about structuring a research project. And like I said, this is not a research class. I'm not going to go into great detail. I'm giving you kind of what I want you to know on the slide. So hint, hint, you probably want to take a picture or come visit the slide very often. So there are two types of methodologies that we employ in social sciences and in science in general when we conduct research. The first one is quantitative. And this is really kind of what you think of when you think of research in general. So quantitative methods are looking at numbers and trying to accumulate numbers so that we can apply statistical analysis to the findings. Quantitative research methodology is all about applying statistical analysis. That's why when you take a research class in social sciences, you also have either a large portion of that research class will be statistical analysis, or I don't know if we do it in the undergrad. I know in the graduate level, we offer the statistical analysis class. Because when you are doing quantitative analysis, you really need to have a firm understanding of statistical analysis and how to apply statistics to your findings. But the quantitative method is all about numbers, and it's all about interpreting data and quantifying those findings. So quantification means having numerical, statistical findings that you can justify the overall findings with. An example of quantitative research methodology is the National Crime Victimization Survey. So in quantitative analysis, how do we get numbers out of theories? Well, one form, and probably the most common form or tool that we use in quantitative research, are surveys. So surveys allow us to ask questions of participants that, one, get their background and characteristic information or their nominal information, but it also allows us to get specific information that we can quantify. So how many times have you been victimized? When you were victimized, did you seek assistance? Did you have follow-up assistance? Were you a part of the prosecution? Those are like yes-no answers, and then we take those yes-nos and put numbers to them. And once we get those numbers, we can then apply statistics to those numbers to get analysis trends. Qualitative methods is a different type of methodology. This methodology is set up to where we don't want numbers per se. Qualitative methodology is looking at characteristics. It provides data about characteristics of population rather than the population's variable or a variable within the population. So we don't typically apply statistical analysis with qualitative research if it's pure qualitative research. There is another methodology that we're not really going to go into that's a mixed methodology where you use quantitative and qualitative methodologies in the same research. Again, we're not going to go into that, but for your understanding, I would suggest that you be able to identify examples of each of these types of research as articulated in the book. All right, so what are our sources of data, or how do we get data in criminal justice? Well, there are 4 primary sources of data. I have those sources listed out, and your book goes over those in detail. These are the most common sources that criminal justice researchers utilize when trying to create data for either qualitative or quantitative analysis. So we have the Uniform Crime Report, we have the National Incidence-Based Reporting System, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, and the National Crime Victim Surveys. So you can see that a lot of these sources are quantitative in nature. However, the National Incident-Based Reporting System is arguably more qualitative because it offers more details that researchers can utilize in terms of specific incidents of crimes. The whole purpose of that system is that we can drill down instead of just saying this is how many homicides occurred. The NIBRS actually allows us to look at each of those incidents and kind of bring out some characteristic variables from those incidents. All right, so here's the good part. So we're going to now kind of talk about the theories of family violence. And when we talk about the theories of family violence, it's important to understand why theories are important. And what are theories? Maybe you've never heard of the term theory. Well, I will tell you that theories are ideas that provide a framework for investigating the causal relationships between phenomena. So, in layman's terms, theories give us words are hard. Theories give us explanations of why phenomenon is happening. So when we talk about the theories of family violence, you're going to see a lot of these theories seek to justify why the violence is happening. So the theoretical basis for family violence has 2 major perspectives that compete against each other. The first perspective is the family violence perspective. And you have different theories that make up the family violence perspective, and we're going to go into each of those theories individually. But the family violence perspective acknowledges gender asymmetry and unjustified criminal violence. There are numerous criminological theories that look at violence as a whole, not just singular victimization. And what I mean by that is the violence against women perspective basically says that family violence is just violence against women. It does not take into account the other types of violence, like child abuse, elder abuse, spousal abuse, where men are the victims. Instead, violence against women, that perspective only sees the victimization of women as being the primary cause of family violence. So the biggest difference between the two is the family violence perspective recognizes the gender asymmetry in family violence, and it recognizes that there are numerous criminological theories that we can apply to family violence that look at other victims outside of women that kind of lead to explanations of why family violence occurs. Hope that didn't confuse you. All right, so let's look at some of the theories of the family violence perspective. And let me get my notes. So there are three main categories that make up the family violence perspective. The first category are the crime theories. And so these categories I want you to think of as subsections of the perspective. So you guys know by now, or you should know, I like my umbrella analogies. So family violence perspective, the perspective itself, is the umbrella category. And out of that category, you have different columns that hold that category up. The first column is the crime theories column. And that basically is the utilization of criminological theories to explain family violence. Now, crime theories view family violence as a criminal assault that takes place within a legally defined domestic relationship. So that's why we utilize criminological theories to explain the phenomenon of family violence. The first, and some of these, if you've had a criminology course, will sound very familiar, and they should. And if you haven't, then you're going to be exposed to these for when you do take a criminology course. So there are two main criminological theories that we use to explain the crime theory's tenet of the family violence perspective. The first one is the rational choice theory. And the rational choice theory recognizes free will. And it basically states that free or rational choice theory states that criminal behavior is more than just a response to social pressures or upbringing. It's a conscious choice by the offender to act out on that violence. And according to this perspective, offenders calculate the relative cost and benefit of the behavior and choose to commit the crime when the benefits outweigh the cost. And so I always remembered rational choice theory in college by thinking of it as this is the theory that encompasses cost-benefit analysis. So if the cost that I'm giving up or the limitations to my free liabilities are less than the major benefits that I would get from taking this action, then I'm probably going to take the action because the benefits outweigh the cost. However, if the cost outweighs the benefits, then I'm probably not going to act on it and take that action. The next theory that makes up the crime theories column is the deterrence theory. And the deterrence theory is basically based on an idea that punishment must be swift and sure to deter crime. So Caesar Beccaria really kind of fathered the deterrence theory. And in the time he wrote what has become a tenet in criminological studies, a book called Of Crime and Punishment. And during that time, there was a lot of unequal justice going on. And so Beccaria, or Beccaria, or however you want to say it, it's pronounced Beccaria. But Beccaria basically says, wait, if we're truly going to deter criminal action from happening, one, we can't wait months to punish the criminal offense. And two, the offender has to know that they're going to be punished for the offense. The deterrent effect of punishment can either be specific or general. So the deterrence theory in and of itself has little prongs under it. And it's either specific deterrence or general deterrence. And so specific deterrence says that the punishment should be tailored toward the individual offender to deter that individual offender from doing the criminal action again. The general deterrence theory says that society should see that we are utilizing swift and sure punishment of this type of criminal offense, and their recognition that we are punishing this acts as a deterrent from anyone else in that society from doing the same crime. So you see rational choice and deterrence theories being our criminological theoretical underpinning in the family violence perspective. Together, they're grouped under the crime theories tenet of family violence perspective. The next tenet is the individual pathology and psychology theories. And these theories are fascinating because it really takes a kind of an inner approach to the offender themselves. Whereas the crime theories tenet looked at the crime in general and said the criminal act is what causes family violence to happen. The individual pathology and psychology theories really look at the individual offender pathology and psychological makeup. So the first part of this tenet is the biochemical imbalance theory. And the biochemical imbalance theory is made up of several different scientific theories, as you can see. Sorry, guys. So we see people who fall into this category trying to explain criminal behavior through saying that there might have been a hormonal imbalance, blood sugar issues, adrenaline level, substance abuse causes criminality because the physiological composition of the substance and the biological composition of the individual themselves interact to cause criminality. A very popular biochemical theory has to deal with the link between testosterone levels in men. So this part of the theory basically says that increased testosterone in men causes increased aggressiveness, which leads to more criminality. In terms of family violence, you see this utilized with it saying the increased. I'll use this as an example. So, I'm a huge professional wrestling fan. And with that, several years back, there was a professional wrestler named Chris Benoit. And Chris Benoit was a very popular wrestler, worked for the WWF at the time, which was the World Wrestling Federation. And Chris Benoit was widely known throughout the world and very well respected. Well, Chris Benoit one weekend murdered his family. He had a young son named Daniel, and his wife Nancy, who was also a professional wrestler. And no one could understand why this happened. So, as we have gone through the years, there's been several explanations. But the most popular deals with the biochemical imbalance theory. And the generalized consensus of why this happened was that age and time in professional wrestling, wrestlers used steroids, which increased testosterone levels. And we know that increased testosterone levels causes increased aggressiveness in men. So, in theorizing why this happened, if you take a biochemical imbalance approach to that, you're explaining the family violence situation and the Chris Benoit situation as being caused by steroid use and increased testosterone levels. Hope that makes sense. Your next theory under the individual pathology and psychology theory is the individual pathology and mental illness theories. So basically, this theory says that there is a strong relationship between domestic violence and a variety of mental disorders. Violent perpetrators exhibit behaviors similar to persons suffering from personality disorders. Correlations between childhood abuse and neglect and other social problems have also been indicated in these type of individuals. And these individuals, meaning the offenders, are highly resistant to counseling and other forms of intervention, which suggest a psychopathological sickness. So the mental illness theories under the individual pathology and psychology theories basically tries to explain violence in terms of mental illness, which has a lot of credibility. MRI scans have shown varying degrees of brain activity, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, ADD, things like that. Those psychological disorders typically fall within that realm of this perspective. All right. So your third tenet to the family violence perspective is your family-based theories. And I am a fan of the family-based theories because of my work in child welfare. And you'll see kind of why I'm a fan of these theories. as we talk about them. So the first model that falls under the family-based theory is the social psychological model. And this model is an integrated model. And you may be asking, Mr. Dean, what do you mean by an integrated model? Well, an integrated model is a model that is made up of differing theories. And this model kind of brings the best of those different theories together to try to explain the phenomenon. So this theory, the social psychological model, brings together different criminological theories of causation. So it brings together social learning theory, unequal power relationships, and the personal choice theory. This model uses a broad application of social learning theory to explain that people who abuse have learned to do so through either direct instruction, through modeling behavior, and through reinforcement. Second, unequal power relations, whether they be real or perceived, contribute to the likelihood that abusive behavior will be tolerated, which is an idea based out of the feminist school of thought. And then the third dimension of this model recognizes that family abuse is a personal choice. The abuser acts out with violence instead of using alternative methods of conflict resolution. So you see that there are some criminological theories, the last portion can be attributed to rational choice theory as well. So the thing about social psychological model that differentiates from any of the crime theories is that integration of the different theories to make up the model. I hope that didn't confuse you. If it did, reach out to me. You can read a little bit more in your book about that as well. The next tenet of the family-based theories is a theory known as culture of violence. And the basis of this theory states that violence is accepted in our Western cultures. And so, because we accept violence in our society, we also accept that violence is going to happen. And instead of trying to empower people with conflict resolution, we have truly empowered people to only turn to violence whenever conflict arises. Theorists point out the pervasiveness of violence in entertainment and as a mean for settling disputes at personal and national levels as really kind of the leading factor in the culture of violence theory. The implied approval of violence is acknowledged and legitimizes the use of violence to settle family disputes as well in this theory. And this theory claims that violence occurs at all levels of society as an accepted means to resolve difficult situations. All right, so now let's look at the gender role theory. And an ex-colleague of mine from DFACS and I used to talk about this theory a lot in terms of she has two boys, and one of her boys is a hellion. And so she is very much a social worker and wants to try to break the gender norms of society with her children to let them know that it's okay to kind of be who they are. So she's trying to take on a gender role informed stance to parenting by kind of breaking those gender norms that society has implemented on boys and girls. So in our conversation, as far as the family violence perspective goes, the gender role theory blames traditional socialization of children into gender roles as a leading cause for violence. In this perspective, children are oriented early in life as either victims or perpetrators based off of their gender. Girls are taught to be passive and yielding to the stronger male sex. So although you don't see patriarchy, the word patriarchy in this, because the term patriarchy is utilized in the in the violence against women perspective. However, you see the implications of patriarchy kind of permeating throughout the gender role theory. Proponents of the gender role theory suggest that society dictates the roles of women in marriage, in child responsibility, and toward family duties, all of which make them vulnerable to abuse. The gender role norms of our society dictate that men are supposed to be the head of the household. And what did we see whenever we looked at the historical origins of family violence throughout the world? We saw that those cultural norms kind of permeated the violence that was being perpetrated against women. They all recognized that the male species were supposed to be the dominant species. And as a result of that, those societies kind of either implicitly or outright recognized the submissive nature of women. All right, so let's go to the social disorganization theory. And this theory is also a criminological theory that you will see in criminology, but it's explained under the family-based theories. Now, why is that? Well, the social disorganization theory really looks at a macro level of violence and tries to explain violence from a macro level. And a macro level means a community level. So, social disorganization theory states that a breakdown in formal and informal controls that might otherwise mitigate family conflict encourages criminal conduct. So, what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at poverty. Poverty in transitional neighborhoods is believed to contribute to the lawlessness that results. People who emphasize this theory basically say it's necessary to turn to criminality to survive in impoverished neighborhoods. They also say that the tenets of family may not be what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, everybody's trying to call me while I'm recording lectures. The social disorganization theory basically says that the tenets of the community may not be as strong as they should be, and these breakdowns cause criminal violence. So you have poverty. When you have poverty, you typically have families that are either out of work or single parent families or double parent families that work all the time to try to keep what they have. As a result of poverty, the parents are out of the picture typically. So then you have some social learning theory coming in with that. You also have lower education values. You have schools that either are not up to par or education is not valued in those communities. So you have this social disorganization within the community setting that sets the norms of that community. And in criminology, social disorganization theory basically says that the breakdowns of these social institutions causes an individual to turn to violence or crime in order to compensate for what they're not getting. And in terms of family violence, we're saying and utilizing the social disorganization theory by saying, well, these social institutions have broken down in these people's society. That's caused a acceptance of violence or an acceptance of criminal behavior, which has in turn caused violence in the family to kind of occur and permeate. And then finally, you have, or not finally, I missed one. You have the social learning theory, which we talked a little bit about in the social psychology model and then a little bit just now in the social disorganization. But basically, social learning theory states that people are not born with violent tendencies. Instead, they learn them through peer interactions, through family, through social institutions within the community. Deviance is learned in the same manner as normative behavior. The process for learning through communication is through communication with others, and kind of reinforced by rewarding that behavior. The primary source of learning occurs in intimate personal groups such as family and peers in the social learning theory view. Okay, so finally, we have something called the intergenerational trauma transmission theory. This one is one that, again, is a macro level theory that I enjoy. I spent a lot of time in grad school, my last several semesters, kind of looking at intergenerational trauma and how that kind of affects the criminal justice system. But the basis of the intergenerational transmission theory states that abusive behavior is handed down from generation to generation as an appropriate way to deal with conflict. So it does not mean that violent tendencies is an inherited trait. Rather, they're experienced. So what does that mean? Well, it means that people who observe violence in the home as children are more likely to resort to battering in their relationships later in life. And this, in turn, can also be flipped and turn into a victimology theory. Women, and we've actually discussed this, women who witnessed their mothers in abusive relationships are at greater likelihood to be victims themselves. That is an intergenerational transmission of that behavior and the acceptance of that behavior. So that is what we mean with intergenerational transmission theory. And as you can see in the family-based theories, you're really looking at the familial unit or the community makeup and how those units contribute to the criminal behavior. So when you're looking at crime theories, you're really just looking at the crime itself, right? Then the individual pathology and psychology theories are looking at the individual offender themselves and characteristics of the offender. Well, the family-based theories is looking at those social structures, community, family makeup, societal norms, all of that. So all three of those tenets together make up the family violence perspective. And remember, the family violence perspective acknowledges that gender asymmetry as a definition for family violence as a whole. All right, so I am in the way of some of the wording on this, and I apologize for that. But let's turn now to the violence against women theory. And the violence against women theory, remember, only recognized that violence against women is what makes up family violence. So the violence against women perspective, I should say, not theory, but the perspective doesn't recognize the gender asymmetry in family violence, and it doesn't recognize other forms of family violence like child abuse or elder abuse or men being victimized. It only focuses on women as victims. So there are three main, yes, I had to double check. There are three main kind of theories that make up the violence against women perspective. And the first one is the feminist socio-political theory. And this theory is all about patriarchy. And it basically states that intimate partner violence as an endemic to cultures influenced by patriarchal social structures. So what does that mean? Well, it basically states that our societal norm is to victimize women. And through patriarchy, which we've talked about, that's the social structure that kind of recognizes men as the dominant sex. Women continue to be victimized because this is our societal norm. Now, in the feminist socio-political theory, they dictate some dynamics of abusive relationships that are very important to kind of understand. So there are three main dynamics that make up the feminist socio-political theory. The first one is that gender relationships are considered a fundamental component of social life. The experiences of gender are therefore emphasized. Both men and women are a part of this analysis, but greater emphasis is placed on the differences within societal norms. And it's viewed within the power relationship structure of those societal norms. The second dynamic is the is the focus on the privileged status of men in society. And because societies typically view men as the more dominant, privileged of the two genders, there is an inherent quality of control over women that permeates. So you look at this, men are the traditional lawmakers. They're the traditional landowners. Up until the 1960s, women couldn't participate in political engagement. So you see that female participation in society justifies that there's going to be violence against them because there's a recognition that they have to be subservient. And then finally, the final dynamic of the feminist socio-political theory is that we need to focus on ending the subordination norm of women and kind of empower our society to recognize women as equal to men and not subservient or lesser than. All right. So the next theory that makes up the violence against women perspective is the gender inequality theory. And this is a very complex perspective, but it basically says, remember, back when we talked about the family violence theories and the family-based theory, there was this inequality kind of stance. Well, in the violence against women perspective, they kind of latch on to that stance and say the gender inequality theory expounds that violence occurs against women and makes up what we should consider family violence because women are powerless within the family unit. Economic discrimination happens. So remember in the 40s and 50s, your parents, your grandparents, women were the traditional homemakers. They weren't able to go out and get jobs. Or if they did get jobs, they got lesser paying jobs and lesser jobs of less status. So they were like lunchroom ladies, they were secretaries, things like that. The final theory that makes up the violence against women perspective is probably the most important theory that I need you to take out of today. It is called the coercive control theory. And basically, this theory defines violence against women as a strategic course of gender-based abuse in which some combination of physical or sexual violence occurs. There are typically 8 methods that are associated with the coercive control theory. And sorry, I can tell I've been talking for over an hour. And these coercive methods cause an individual to comply through kind of a brainwashing method. The methods used to shape compliance and undermine the resistance of the victim kind of came about when studying Nazis and Nazi Germany. And so we kind of took looking at how brainwashing happened during that time and found that there were certain methods to their madness to kind of get the person to comply with what they needed them to do. And so we're taking that and applying it in a family violence setting. And it fits perfectly. If you've had any exposure to family violence, you typically hear about the cycle of family violence and the domestic violence wheel and things like that. That is all based off of the coercive control theory. And the coercive control theory is a very good explanation for kind of why victims stay and don't leave. So let's go over the 8 methods right now, okay? So the first is a demonstration of power, which reminds the victim of their potential fate. Reminds the victim of who's in control. Then you have degradation, threats of violence, induced debilitation, isolation, domination, the enforcement of trivial demands, and then all of that is followed up with these random acts of kindness by the perpetrator to kind of show that they love them and kind of reinforce that honeymoon phase. So I'm going to show you this, how it kind of acts out here on the next slide. So here you see the 8 steps of coercive control. And it's important that we recognize these. So here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for me so that I can, there we go. All right, so I'm going to bring my pointer too. So you see that when we talk about family violence, we're talking about power and control, right? So at the center of this is the coercive control and the power ambiguity. So in order to flex the power portion of this, the offender has to enforce trivial demands. And they may utilize degradation as a form of that. And then they have isolation, so they isolate the victim, and they have to continue the power, so they will continue dominating the victim. And they dominate the victim by enforcing trivial demands and making sure that the victim knows that they're powerless in this situation. So they can threaten, they can hold a gun to the victim's head that kind of has this debilitating effect on the victim. The victim feels hopeless. The victim feels like there's nothing they can do because they're isolated. And then they follow up with some random act of kindness, normally after all of this has happened. They follow up with kindness. So like, oh honey, I'm sorry that I hit you last night. That will never happen again. Here are some chocolate and some flowers. Or, I'm going to work on this. Like, I want us to be a family. We have to work on this together. Things like that. So those random occasional kindnesses is a really big component of the control methodology in this theory. And so you're going to see all 8 of these making up this coercive control theory. And like I said at the beginning of this, you really kind of need to understand how this plays out. We call this the cycle of domestic violence and things like that. But I've linked a video in your additional material called Eggshells. It's a 5-minute video that will really kind of help you visually see how these steps interplay. So you see a lot of like arrows going to and from the different parts of it, but they don't happen in a linear sense. So you can have the honeymoon period of getting together in a relationship initially, and then you start seeing these trivial demands happening. So like, I need you to tell me where you're at all times. And when they don't, when the victim doesn't tell the offender where they are, they either degrade them or they threaten them as a form of domination to enforce those demands. And then after they've enforced those demands, they will either be kind to them for a while and do what we call a honeymoon period, or they continue with the threats of violence in a means to debilitate and isolate the victim. And then so all of these kind of, here, I will actually, let's see if I can do this. So you see that at the heart of it is power and control. And you can see all of these kind of making its way as a form of expressing the power, right? And once they have power, they then have control. So each individual incident, you can have an incident Incident number 1. Sorry, I don't have a pen that I can write with, so I'm using my mouse. But so incident number 1, let's say they do demands. We'll do D for demands. They demand, they enforce those demands. Enforce. They enforce those demands with threats of violence, which is represented by the V, or they enforce those demands by degrading the victim as a means to show total domination. Right? And once they have domination, they what? They have the power in the relationship, right? And then once they have the power, they have the control. And once the offender realizes that they have the control, they will have kindness. After the incident, before incident number 2 happens. And then incident number 2, you see this whole cycle kind of going over and over and over again. Now, within either the demand or the enforcement, you see the notion of isolation. So typically in domestic violence situations or intimate partner violence situations, you will have the victim being isolated from their family, from their friends. The only person that this victim can be around is their spouse. If it's a male-female relationship, typically the male is the abuser. And so we see that there's this jealousy of, you can't be around any other males. You can't have male friends. And your girlfriends are no longer your girlfriends because I'm the only friend you need. And so you see this isolation playing a role in the overall power and control. All right. So I hope everyone kind of understands the importance of knowing theories and kind of is able to explain this coercive control theory. Research is necessary to explain the phenomena, and I hope that we've kind of touched on everything that you wanted to touch on during this, and I hope you guys have a great week. As you're going into this week, please remember that your exam is this week, so there's not going to be a discussion board. You will have an opportunity to apply what you have learned as far as the coercive control model goes. That application is in the form of your exam 1 essay question, which will require you to watch a documentary, which is about an hour. So plan your time wisely. Your actual multiple choice true-false portion of your exam will not open up until Wednesday of this week. And I did that on purpose because a lot of you will need time to watch the documentary and do your essay portion first. And then your multiple choice will open on Wednesday and run through Sunday. Both the essay and the multiple choice portion of the exam is due on Sunday. They are due at different times. So your essay portion of the exam will be due at 11:59. Your multiple choice portion of your exam will be due at 11:30. So please pay attention to due dates. Please pay attention to the task list. I will not reopen things. I will not accept late work. So please, please, I'm begging you, pay attention to what you need to do this week. All right, I hope everyone has a great week, and if you need me, feel free to holler. Thank you all.